I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I pulled up my credit monitoring app, sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never drank, and I read the same line 4 times before it actually registered. Hard inquiry. Lender, Sunrise Home Equity Solutions. Date, October 14th. I hadn't applied for anything. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I'm not someone who panics. I spent 3 years as a traveling ICU nurse, which means I've held a stranger's hand while they died, and then walked back to the nurse's station to finish charting. I know how to compartmentalize. I know how to look at a bad situation and think, okay, what do I do next? So I didn't panic. I just started pulling on the thread. The inquiry had come from a lender I'd never heard of. I Googled it. Sunrise Home Equity Solutions was a mid-sized regional lender out of Raleigh, which was interesting because I live in Columbus, Ohio. I'd never done business in North Carolina. I'd never even driven through Raleigh. I called the number on their website. I was on hold for 11 minutes. When the representative finally picked up, I gave her my name and the last 4 of my social and asked if there was an active application in my name. She paused just a second too long before she said she couldn't share that information without verification. I verified. Date of birth, address, mother's maiden name. Another pause. Miss Calloway, she said. And that was the first time I understood something was truly wrong, because my last name is not Calloway. My last name is Mercer. It's been Mercer my entire life. I'm showing an application submitted jointly under your name and a co-applicant. The application is still pending. I asked her to repeat that. She did. I hung up, and then I sat there for a long moment looking at the wall, and I thought about my stepmother. And I thought about how she had been asking my father to refinance the house for the past 8 months. And I thought about how my father had mentioned, very casually at Thanksgiving, that he'd added me as a beneficiary on some paperwork. He'd said it the way you'd mention you'd stopped to pick up milk. Just a thing he'd done. I thought about all of that, and then I went and made a new pot of coffee because the first one had gone completely cold, and I had a lot of work to do. My father married her when I was 22. I was finishing my nursing degree, living in campus housing, barely home. She was, I want to be fair, not terrible at first. She was organized. She kept the house clean. She made my father laugh in a way I hadn't heard since my mother passed when I was 16. Her name is Ingrid. She'd been divorced twice before. She had a real estate license she barely used and a talent for making every conversation eventually circle back to money, specifically to the idea that money should be flowing in her direction. The first time she made a comment about my savings, I was 24. I'd just finished a high-paid travel contract in Phoenix, and I'd come home for a week between assignments. We were sitting at dinner, and I mentioned offhandedly that I'd maxed out my Roth IRA contribution for the year. Ingrid looked at me across the table and said, "Must be nice not to have a mortgage." I smiled and passed the rolls. My father looked at his plate. That was the first time I understood the shape of her. Not evil exactly, not villainous, just hungry. The kind of person who looks at what someone else has built and thinks, some of that should be mine. Over the next couple of years, the comments got more specific. Had I thought about investing in the house? Equity was such a smart move for someone my age. If I put in even a small amount, my father could refinance at a better rate and we'd all benefit. Family should help family. I never engaged. I just smiled and changed the subject and drove home and called my best friend from the parking lot and vented for 45 minutes. What I did not do was tell my father, because every time I tried to say anything, even gently, even once, he'd gotten this look on his face, tired and guilty and somewhere else, and said, "She means well, sweetheart. She just worries about money." He always said she, like Ingrid was a weather system he was reporting on, not a person he'd chosen to marry. I stopped trying. The credit report pulled up 4 things I hadn't authorized. The first was the home equity inquiry in October. The second was a hard pull from a credit card company in September. A card I didn't have, had never applied for, was now apparently 2 months past due. The third was an auto loan inquiry from August. The fourth, and the one that made my stomach actually drop, was a mortgage cosigner inquiry from a bank in Raleigh dated back in July. 4 inquiries. 4 months. A pattern. Someone had been using my social security number systematically since at least the summer. Probably longer. The credit card was already in collections. The balance was $4,200. I know exactly how she got my social security number. My father had added me to his homeowner's insurance policy 3 years ago. He'd asked for my SSN for the paperwork, and I'd given it to him without thinking twice. I trusted my father. He's my dad. You don't think about those things. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, pulling everything I could find. I requested my full credit reports from all 3 bureaus. I screenshotted every inquiry, every account, every address that wasn't mine. Ingrid had apparently tried to list me as residing at my father's house in Raleigh, which I hadn't done since I was in high school. I thought about what I knew. I knew that my father's house had been on the market briefly last spring. I'd seen the listing he'd told me they decided not to sell, and that Ingrid had a real estate license and understood exactly how home equity worked. I knew that a joint home equity application in my name alongside my father's would dramatically improve their borrowing terms because my credit score before all of this had been 791. I knew that my father had signed something somewhere because a joint application requires 2 signatures. He either knew what he was signing or he'd been told it was something else. Both possibilities made me feel sick in different ways. And I knew that I was not going to call him. Not yet. Not until I had everything. I took 2 days off work. I told my charge nurse it was a family emergency, which was true enough. I filed a fraud report with the FTC. I called each of the 3 credit bureaus and placed fraud alerts. I contacted the collections agency about the credit card and told them formally in writing that the account was fraudulent. I sent it certified mail. I called the credit card company directly, got through to their fraud department and gave them everything. Dates, documentation, the fact that I had never lived at the Raleigh address associated with the account. The fraud representative, her name was Anita and she was extraordinarily patient, told me they would need a police report and a notarized identity theft affidavit. I had both within 48 hours. I also contacted Sunrise Home Equity Solutions again. This time I asked for the fraud department directly. I told them there was an active fraudulent application in my name, that I had a police report number, and that I would be following up with a written certified letter and a copy of my FTC report. The representative I spoke to this time was very quiet for a moment and then said, "We will flag this application immediately." The application was still pending. It hadn't funded yet. I had gotten there in time. But here's the thing about getting there in time. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like standing at the edge of something you almost fell into, looking down and trying to understand how close it actually was. The application was for $47,000. I drove to Raleigh on a Thursday. I didn't call ahead. I want to explain the decision not to call, because I know how it sounds. He's my father. He's the only parent I have left. My mother has been gone for 15 years and there are still moments when I reach for the phone to call her, when I see something she would have loved, when I need someone who's known me my whole life. But I had sat with this long enough to understand something clearly. If I called, Ingrid would know I was coming. And if Ingrid knew I was coming, evidence would disappear. She would coach my father on what to say. She would have 3 days to make it clean. She had done this carefully and over months. She was not careless. I couldn't afford to give her a warning. So I drove 4 hours and I parked in front of my father's house on a Thursday morning and I knocked on the door. My father answered. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which had only been at Thanksgiving 2 months before. He looked tired. He looked, when he saw me standing on the porch with no notice and no luggage, immediately afraid. "Sweetheart," he said, "I didn't know you were coming." "I know," I said. "Can I come in?" Ingrid was in the kitchen. I heard her before I saw her, the specific sound of her, the way she always had something happening, something on the stove, some project underway. She came to the doorway when she heard my voice, and her face arranged itself into the particular shape it always did when she saw me, warm on the surface, measuring underneath. "What a surprise," she said. "It really is," I agreed. I sat down at the kitchen table. I put my folder on the table, printed documents, highlighted, organized in the order I wanted to walk through them, and I looked at my father. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He sat down. Ingrid stayed standing, which told me something. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. I have spent 3 years learning how to deliver bad news to people, how to say the hard thing calmly, how to hold your own steadiness when the person across from you is losing theirs. I used all of that. I told him what I'd found. I went through it in order. The credit card opened in September, the auto loan inquiry in August, the mortgage cosigner application in July, the home equity application in October. I showed him the addresses listed. I showed him my social security number appearing on documents I'd never signed. I showed him the fraud reports. My father's face went grey. Ingrid said, "I can explain." "I know you can," I said, "and I would like you to, actually. I'd like to hear the explanation for how a joint home equity application in my name was submitted to a lender in October, and how my social security number appeared on a credit card account that currently has a $4,200 past due balance, and how exactly my name ended up on a cosigner inquiry for a mortgage I was never told about." The room was very quiet. My father put his hand over his mouth. He was looking at the table. I watched Ingrid. She was thinking. I could see her calculating what I had, what she could dispute, whether there was a version of this she could explain away. She was not someone who gave up easily. That was the thing I had always known about her and never wanted to acknowledge. She was smart, and she was patient, and she did not stop. She said, "We were in a difficult position financially. Your father and I both thought." "My father," I said, "did not have authorization to use my identity to apply for credit. Neither did you. That's wire fraud. That's identity theft. Those are federal charges." My father made a sound that wasn't quite words. I kept my eyes on Ingrid. "The home equity application hasn't funded yet. I've already spoken to the fraud department at Sunrise. I've filed a police report, an FTC report, and fraud disputes with all 3 bureaus. I have the IP address logs from 2 of the applications which were submitted from this address." I paused. "I want to give you a chance to understand clearly where this stands before I decide what the next step is," Ingrid said. "You would do that to your own family?" I looked at her for a long moment. "You used my social security number without my knowledge or consent," I said. "You opened a credit card in my name that went to collections. You were about to take $47,000 using my identity as collateral. You did this over at least 4 months. You did it carefully and deliberately." I folded my hands on the table. "What exactly is the family part of that?" She didn't answer. My father started crying. Not dramatically, he's not a dramatic man. Just quietly, in the way of someone who has known for a while that a reckoning was coming and is not entirely surprised to find it at the table. "Here is what I did not do. I did not forgive it. I did not offer a payment plan. I did not give them a way out. Here is what I did do. I told my father that I loved him and that I was not making this decision in anger, but that I had already submitted everything to law enforcement and the lenders, and that process was not something I could or would stop, because it wasn't something I had started for revenge. I had started it because my credit, my financial identity, my future, none of those things had ever been theirs to take. I told him that the $1,400 credit card balance was going to be paid, not by me. I told him that if the home equity application was formally withdrawn by him directly, with a written letter to the lender, I would note that in my communications with law enforcement as a cooperative action, he said, "She told me you'd never find out." I looked at him. I looked at him for a long time. I'm an ICU nurse, Dad. I watch monitors for a living. I know what a bad reading looks like. He wrote the letter that afternoon. Ingrid sat at the table and didn't speak while he did it. The police investigation took 6 months. Ingrid was charged with 2 counts of identity theft and 1 count of wire fraud. The home equity lender filed a separate complaint related to the fraudulent application. My father was not charged. The investigators determined he had signed documents under a misrepresentation of what they were, which I believed, and which was also the most painful part of all of it, because it meant he had been played too, just from the inside, from the person sleeping next to him. He called me when she was formally charged. It was 8 in the morning and I was driving to work, and I pulled over in a parking lot to take the call. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say things when they've been sitting with them for a long time and the words have gotten worn smooth. I said, I know. He said I didn't know what she was doing. Not all of it. I want you to know that. I said I believe you, and I do. I genuinely do. But belief and closeness are different things. Trust and love are different things. I love my father. I will probably always love my father. But there is a version of our relationship, the one where I drove down to see him for Thanksgiving without checking whether my credit was clean first, the one where I handed over my social security number without a second thought because he was my dad. That is gone. Not as punishment, just as a fact. Some things, once you understand what they were, you can't unknow. Ingrid pled guilty to reduced charges in April. She received 18 months of probation, a fine, and a civil judgment that attached to her real estate license. She and my father filed for divorce in May. He's renting an apartment in the same neighborhood. He texts me sometimes, articles he thinks I'd like, pictures of his dog. I text back, it's not nothing. The credit card debt was resolved through the fraud process, removed from my report. 0 liability, no lasting damage. My credit score as of last month is back to 784 and climbing. The 4 fraudulent inquiries were removed. It's like they were never there, except I know they were there. I have the folder. I will probably always have the folder. There's a thing I think about sometimes. When I'm driving home from a long shift, when the highway is empty and it's just me and the dark and whatever's on the radio, I think about that Thanksgiving comment. Must be nice not to have a mortgage. I think about how I smiled and passed the rolls and how I drove home and vented to my best friend and how I told myself it wasn't worth a confrontation. I was right that it wasn't worth a confrontation. What I didn't know yet was that it was worth watching. Some people show you exactly who they are, in small moments, years before they do anything big. The hunger was always there. I just chose, for a long time, not to look directly at it. I look at everything directly now. That's not bitterness. That's just what the last year cost me and what I got in return. A locked door has a price. I paid mine, and I closed it myself. There's a version of this story where I never checked, where I kept smiling at dinner, passing the rolls, driving home and venting to my best friend and telling myself it wasn't worth a confrontation, where I handed Ingrid 4 more years of access to my financial identity because I didn't want to make my father uncomfortable. That version of this story ends very differently. I think about that sometimes, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. The things that happen to us aren't random. They follow a logic. Ingrid had been showing me exactly who she was since I was 24 years old. Every comment about my savings, every redirect toward family investment, every moment she looked at what I'd built and calculated how to make it hers, that was information. I just chose, for a long time, to file it away instead of act on it. What changed wasn't the fraud. What changed was that I stopped waiting for someone else to protect me. That's the thing nobody really talks about when they tell stories like this one. People focus on the villain, on Ingrid's calculation, her patience, the specific mechanics of what she did. And yes, what she did was wrong. Unambiguously, legally, federally wrong. But the part that actually sits with me, the part I carry into my life now, is what I did. The 2 days I took off work, the certified letters, the fraud department calls, the 4-hour drive without warning, The folder on the table, organized in the order I wanted to walk through it. I did that, not out of rage, out of something quieter and more durable. The decision that my name, my credit, my future belonged to me, and that I was going to defend them with the same steadiness I bring to a 12-hour ICU shift. My father cried at that table. He's a good man who made a serious mistake in trusting someone who didn't deserve it. I understand that. I've made peace with it mostly. But I also understood, sitting across from him, that love doesn't require me to absorb consequences that aren't mine. You can love someone completely and still hold a line. Those two things don't cancel each other out. The practical lesson is, check your credit reports. Put alerts on your accounts. Treat your social security number like the key to your house. Know your rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. These things exist to protect you, but only if you use them. The deeper lesson is harder to put into words, but I'll try. Ingrid was smart. She was patient. She was thorough. And she still lost. Not because the universe punished her, but because I was smarter, more patient, and more thorough. Integrity without follow-through is just a feeling. What makes it real is the documentation, the certified mail, the drive to Raleigh on a Thursday morning when every part of you wants to stay home and pretend it isn't happening. The credit card debt is gone. The inquiries are removed. My score is climbing back. What's left is something harder to quantify and more worth keeping. The knowledge that when it mattered, I handled it. Calmly, completely, on my own terms. A locked door has a price. I paid mine, and I closed it myself.